So we're recording this presentation today, and it will show up in our YouTube channel for the Dougherty Clan Association. And Rosie is kind of handling our back end things, and she will help answer questions if you have, or remind Will of the questions that you have later in our question time. And she'll also be posting some things in the chat. So hopefully that you'll know and be aware of how to use chat. We're also so busy and used to using, I think, video presentations, particularly over the last 5 years. So anyway, so today we're going to be hearing from Will Dougherty, and this is just another one of the ongoing classes that we offer once a month over Zoom. And if any of you have any ideas of a class that you would like to have, currently right now we have 7 videos on our YouTube channel that kind of show you what we've been doing over the last year of doing these videos. And we kind of started last year with our December hangout, and we had so much fun at that sort of sparked the idea to have other classes. So please feel free to go to the YouTube channel and subscribe if you want to. There's no cost for subscribing, so we do appreciate your participation in that. And let's see. So I want to introduce Will to you. And he's given me his bio, which is fun. It gives you a little idea of all the things that he does. And one of the things that I am most grateful for is he serves on our board for the Dougherty Clan Association. And we're really grateful for the work he does there, manages our website, and just gives us really good insight and ideas during our meetings. So, but Will Dougherty is raised in the Ozarks. If you're not from the US, you might not know where that is. So Will, you might have to tell him. He's a husband and a father of 3, and they're very cute little kids. I love it when they get on our calls. He pastors, he works in IT and data reporting for a college, and raises cattle on his family farm. You might have to ask him which of those 3 is most important, but I would think the husband, father, and then pastoring would be in the primary roles for him. It says after being homeschooled and scoring the highest GED score in Missouri, he earned bachelor's degree in accounting and business. His interest in Ireland and family history began as a youth in July 2000. I was old then, sorry. And when his father brought home a printout from an early O'Doherty website. Since then, he's enjoyed recording family stories, researching and writing about his Dougherty lineage, contributing to the clan website, and exploring the lesser known stories we all share in the medieval era of our O'Doherty roots. In 2024, he released a book that was mostly written during COVID quarantines, when he explored the story behind the name of a Massachusetts Great Pond to uncover a long forgotten family history. So we're going to learn more about his book, and we're going to put the website for this book into the chat as well. So if you're interested, you can purchase a copy. So here you go, Will. Can't wait to hear from you.
Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate you and the rest of the board asking me to present this. It's something that I have enjoyed doing the research for, and I guess I'll just kind of delve into how it got started and what quirky little ways ended up getting here. So I appreciate you joining this, or if you're watching on YouTube later, we appreciate that, and hope that you definitely click subscribe and like that, that you would support the work in that way. But years ago, I guess, like Miss Eva said, I was about 12 or something in there, and my dad brings home a printed out black and white copy of an early Dougherty website, and he says, "Good King Dougherty captured St. Patrick," and I read it and I'm like, it wasn't King Dougherty, but nevertheless, it remained King Dougherty, and that's okay. Good King Dougherty. There was actually a King Dougherty. There were 2 of them at one point, but that was some years later. That's another discussion, so we won't break into that today. But I would sit around with a tape deck and record my grandpa's stories and on both sides, and started writing things down. And when I went to college, I got a hold of the internet and Ancestry.com, and I just went wild and built a family tree that had so many people in it that I finally one day, one of my cousins approached me and said, you don't have any evidence for this. And that kind of set me back, and I was very unhappy with her until I realized the truth. You know what? I need evidence. If I'm going to say so and so was my ancestor, I need something that will prove it. So I began to learn how to research, and we worked back together, and she would help pick apart some of my research, and she would find clues, and I would pick them apart. And so we eventually uh, I started putting down some of the work that we did on paper. And if you go on the Out in the Clan website, there's this example research. And ultimately, what I wrote came down into this little booklet of about how many pages I don't know. Anyway, uh, it's more pages than I want to admit. Let's see, here's 132 pages. So it starts out with uh, an old letter that was a transcript of the family Bible. And I went from there and began going back and hit my brick wall. And Zach helped me. Zach Dougherty is our DNA administrator, and he was very helpful in the process of this. But ultimately, I visited Ohio, along where the Ohio and Erie Canal used to be, and I dug around in the courthouse there and found business records. Uh, and ultimately, we did Y-DNA testing and connected back not only to
Doreen's new mix.
um,
Sitting
where
with
we come
Doreen's
from,
new
but
mix.
actually connected to the actual family. I went and visited some of the family in upstate New York, and they said we knew that there was another brother who went west, and our records show that he drowned in the Erie Canal. Well, mine shows up on the Erie, Ohio Canal. We did some triangulation of autosomal DNA, and we did some Y-DNA, and ultimately everything matched. Our stories matched, all of our family circumstances matched, down to occupations and family naming patterns and religious traditions and family stories, even artifacts that we had that come to find out the old family axe come from New York. So it was all very interesting. And when we get to the end of this research, I'm finding muster rolls from the Revolutionary War and various records in which the family name is spelled a variety of ways. You can see here Charles Dougherty, Dorety. And here, there's just so much information. And you can see here, this is my first putting down of its interest to know that not far south of Worcester is a place called Dorothy Pond. Well, anyway, I started doing some research, and what I wanted to do was see, well, what did this countryside look like? Well, before I found out the Dorothy Pond place name, I was just looking for what kind of landscape it was, because that's part of the story where our family lives at. That's part of the story of their life. Everyone lives somewhere, and the geography and the agriculture and the climate and everything ties into all the story. It's not just I found a document and here's a data point, but there's stories that can be fleshed out of all this. So I'm scrolling across here, and I scroll past this little lake, and I'm like, wait a minute, I saw something there. Dorothy Pond. And normally this would be just another site, here's some other pond, but it clicked in my head, and I had to kind of retrace my step, and it took me a minute to find it. And I'm like, oh, Dorothy Pond, because in the research, I had come across some documents like this. And here you can see a Revolutionary War record. This is a muster roll dated winter quarters, January 13th, 1778. This is Valley Forge. And here's Charles Dougherty, first lieutenant in Company D of the 12th Massachusetts Regiment. Well, in the same record, just a couple months before, it spelled Charles Dorothy, Dorothy. And so when I saw Dorothy Pond in the map, I said, this is way too close. Here's Worcester, here's Dorothy Pond. That's too close to just pass up. There could be something there. Definitely there's a clue, there's a hunch, whether the hunch pays off. Uh, so I just begin to play the hunch. And as I begin to research this, I reached out to the local historical societies. I begin to contact people in Millbury, Massachusetts, in Worcester, Massachusetts, even in Sutton, Massachusetts. Because as I did the research, I found that the town lines had changed over time, even the county lines had changed. And so I reached out to these, and nobody could tell me how Dorothy Pond got its name. So I said, well, let me do some research. And you research for a while, and then you get, burnt out on it. And I went on to something else. And after a while, I come back and I do a little research on it. And I never give up. Once I have a good hunch, unless I have something that throws me off, I just keep on going. And so on August Well, let me scoot back. This was January when I went across the map of 2018 and I saw the name. And in March, I just happened to be going to upstate New York, and we was up there. I was doing some family history research, and my wife wanted to go to New York City. When we got to Albany, she said, well, it's only so many hours to Boston. Why don't we go to Boston just for the fun of it? And I said, sure, why not? Because in the back of my mind, I was thinking, if we go to Boston, I can stop at Dorothy Pond. So we made the little detour and got into our hotel in Joyce about 1 a.m. with having went by Dorothy Pond. And I thought that was the coolest thing ever, even though I only had like 10 or 15 minutes there. But to get to go there and see there, because I believed enough that there could be a connection that I wanted to stop there. Well, it was 2020 on August 25th, and I had done some research, and I finally said, let me put what I have in writing. And so I begin to write down, and that's when things blew up. I had one page, I believe 5 paragraphs on August 25th of 2020, and 5 months later, in January of 2021, I had 120 pages. So the moral of the story is don't just let it float around in your mind, write it down. So you're getting the story of how this came to be. I'll also kind of lead you through my thought process on it and some of the things that brought me to these conclusions, but I hope maybe it might even be an inspiration to you. So as I begin to do this research, what I come across was the lack of records. There's no specific record that says, Charles Dougherty was the owner of a particular plot of land there in the vicinity of Dorothy Pond. In fact, so I begin to look at the books. I begin to look at the early histories of the area, history of the county of Worcester, and they actually spelled it kind of weird. But we get here, and I begin to look at the town histories, and it says the earliest name by which the sheet of water was called a South Pond. In the proprietor's book, the name Dorothy early appears as its name, however. Just how this name was received has not been determined. And I'm like, a dead end, yet again. And they list 50 different spellings of the name. And I'm like, some of these, Doherty's, uh, Dougherty, there's a lot of similarities in the name here. And so I said, well, let's do some more research. And What ultimately I come to was that there was a lot of this Dorothy spelling, but when I found this is from an 1831 transcript, and it says Dorothy's. But if you look at the original document from 1728, and I was able to get the Sutton Historical Commission, Keith Downer, he was so nice to pull out of their safe. Um, well, actually, no, he didn't pull out of the safe because the original's in the safe, but he had a 1960s facsimile of the documents, and he that at some point somebody dropped them and those are all out of order, but he went through it enough to find several references. And here's one of the early references: Dorrity, Doherty's Pond or South Pond. So what I discovered was that the historian who transcribed the original 1700s document in 1831, when he transcribed it, he standardized the spelling to Dorothy's Pond because that was what he believed it should be, based on some incorrect evidence. And I actually work through in here the chain of custody of the original book and how it came back into the town of Sutton's custody. But um, when I got to talking to people who lived around the pond, I noticed that there were a certain amount of the earlier residents who pronounced it Doherty, and they still to this day call it Doherty Pond, even though it's spelled Dorothy Pond. Here's an early postcard from 1910, Dority Pond. I say, there's got to be something to all of this. And so as I do my research, I said, well, let's see if there was any other Doherty family. Maybe there was a Dorothy family. So I began to research. There was a Dorothy family in Boston in the early 1700s. I found them in the town registers, but what I found was that by the 1740s, when there's more Irish immigrants appearing in the Boston ports, the names of this particular family begins to change in the register, and it's no longer Dorothy, but it's now Dougherty and Dougherty. Those are just variations of our surname, Doherty. So I said, if this Dorothy is actually Doherty, then the pond name could be as well. So I began scouring the local town and county histories, the probate records, the land records, and ultimately the only Dohertys that I found was my Doherty family. There were no other Dorothy family except misspellings of my Doherty family. And so you do the process of elimination to make sure that you're not just finding a record that looks convenient to you. I say, well, because mine sounds like this and mine was in the area, it should be. So first I did the process to see were there others. And here, what you can see is in the Worcester Registry of Deeds, here it gives you various spellings of the Doherty surname. It says also see Doherty, Doroty. Very interesting. So with that, I begin to research any connection that my specific family had, um, and also looked at the history of the pond. So I put a poll out on the local community's Facebook group and said, how do you pronounce the name of the pond? And I had 15% of responding residents said we pronounce it with a hard T, Doherty. Doherty, Dorothy, Little Doherty. Uh, and then here you can look here at this postcard. This is dated 1915, and it says Doherty Pond, Doherty Pond. So I'm like, wow, that's pretty amazing. Here is a document which calls it Doherty Pond. And in fact, here's one from 1848 that spells it just like my family spelled it. Well, of course, they spelled it a variety of ways. Um, but I began to find these references. Here's one where it was spelled Dohrothy. I don't know what they were smoking, but they spelled it some very interesting ways. Um, and of course, I had this Revolutionary War muster roll. So what I determined was that the various spellings of the pond's name very much coincided with the various spellings of my own surname. Here's something from the Massachusetts Archives, which very clearly connects the spelling Dorothy with the spelling Dougherty and a variety of other records. Here's some town births: Dorothy, Dorothy, Dougherty. So there was something about the pronunciation, perhaps the accent, the maybe lack of familiarity with an Irish surname, while most Massachusetts immigrants are from England. Um, and ultimately, I found out when and why the pronunciation of the name changed, actually. It was standardized, and here's my little footnoted story. It's a rather long footnote, but you keep all the footnotes just for grins. Anyway, um, this lady says, growing up, we called it Doherty Pond, but as I got older, it morphed into Dorothy. So you see the kind of shift. So I knew that the pond had this earlier name, but how did it get started? And I dig back into the history and find the first references. And here, November 18th, 1724, is a record in the proprietor's book of the town in which the first record of Dorothy Pond having this name is listed. And it says its alias was South Pond. That was the earlier name. And so I began to research, well, when did my family arrive there? If there wasn't any other Doherty family there, did my Doherty family show up before or after the pond was named? If they showed up after, that's not really any help to me. It may not have that origin. But if they showed up before, so unfortunately, I don't have any. Ellis Island was not a thing. I guess it was a thing, but it just didn't have any buildings and ports and infrastructure to receive people into our country. It's a rather modern thing, and even some of the other, uh, it was more or less England had colonized America. And to move from one part of the domain to the other part, there was perhaps not a necessity of having records because you weren't moving from one country to another. You were just moving to the same part of the British domain. So sparse records. And my family's records said that we were Scots-Irish and that we had come over. They were Protestant. And so I began looking for, I knew that the first records of my family was they appeared in Worcester. The earliest reference I found was a deed uh, dated January 1729, where the nephew of the very first settler of the third the third attempt to colonize Worcester, the very first settler's nephew, Charles Doherty, my ancestor, signed as a witness to that deed in 1729. So I knew they were at least there that early, but at that point, it seemed that he was already established. The records that I had showed that he was, it wasn't like he had just arrived there. So did he or did he not show up before 1724, which is when the pond first was called by this? That was my question. So as I begin to look when the Dohertys arrived, I begin to look at the history of Worcester, and so I read through all the histories of Worcester town, Worcester County, and that central Massachusetts region to see when were what immigrations were there, and it's very plainly there was a large wave of Scots-Irish immigration about 1717, 1718, and then from then on it kind of moved farther south. Um, Here's Dr. James Leyburn of University of North Carolina giving this explanation. It says that um, the Ulstermen who went to Boston found unexpected difficulties. They weren't received very well. And those who followed over the next 2 years were made to understand that they were not at all welcome. Then the people begin to shift farther south, coming through the Delaware River ports into Pennsylvania, into other areas. But it said until 1720 to go to America meant that they went farther south. So basically, you've got this very small window in which almost any immigrant from Ulster came to that part of Massachusetts. So I said, well, let's begin to research this group. If there's this specific group who arrived, um, and they're very clearly written in the history of Worcester. There was the Reverend Edward Fitzgerald, and there was also another minister, the Reverend John McKinstry. The two of those brought their congregations to Worcester in the summer of 1718. And what I soon found was that Reverend John McKinstry was invited southward to Sutton. Well, Sutton was actually the area where Dorothy Pond was. At that time, Millbury had not been established as a town. And so you got to look at these shifting boundaries over the time and see how that they maybe instead of looking at one courthouse, you should be looking at another. So it's very useful to know, kind of look back into the past. Maybe this town didn't exist at that point. So what was the mother town? And so I began to look at that and what records there was. And I found my family's records, mostly, um, mostly beginning in the 1750s. I found some in some nearby towns, though they had moved by that time. And so in researching, I wanted to focus in and say, okay, when did they arrive? Can I find any evidence of where they come from or how they got here? So as I looked, Charles Dougherty married a woman named Jane. Well, who is Jane? What was her parents? Well, there was no marriage records for that particular time. Marriage records in Worcester weren't recorded until 1747. They started having children in 1731. Well, I found this record where you can hardly read it, but it says that my honored mother-in-law, Eleanor Wallace of Brookfield, aforesaid widow. So he sold his mother some property, or his mother-in-law some property, and by that, then I knew her name was Wallace, Wallis, or I've seen it with AS, but essentially it was a misspelling of the classic Scots name, Wallace, Braveheart. Um, and finally, then I find her will, which says it references the children of her daughter, Jane Dougherty, deceased. So now I've got this connection to there. Well, if you begin to go back and look at it, her will, or her probate rather, it shows that she was some kind of a seamstress or someone who was working with linen yarn. And come to find out, the records show that it was the Scots-Irish who came over in 17 who brought the new fashion linen wheels. They were the craze in Boston right after that. So here's yet another connection that ties them, ties my ancestor, Charles Dougherty, to this immigration that happened in 1718. Well, then I find her headstone. Here lies the body of Miss Eleanor Wallace, relict, it's an old term meaning widow, of Mr. Matthias Wallace, and that she passed away in 1767. Well, I knew nothing of Matthias Wallace, but John Bolton wrote the one of the most popular books on Scots-Irish immigration in the early Scots-Irish. It was called Scots-Irish Pioneers in Ulster in America. He was working at the Boston Athenaeum Library, and in it he includes this quote that connects Mr. Matthias Wallace in the list of the chief Worcester Scots-Irish settlers, along with those that we know for certainty came over in 1718. Um, and Linda Merle, a genealogist who's very much studied this part, she says the Scots-Irish came, unlike later immigrants during the famine, in families, closely allied families, families who had known one another and intermarried in Ireland and who would continue to do so in America. So it wasn't scattered migrations that one decided to go here and one to there, but they were very clannish, and they stuck together because they were, well, coming into kind of somewhat hostile territory. They Here, my first record of Charles Dougherty showed up in 1729, which was 11 years after the migration. And here Charles Bolton says some of those in the course of 10 years returned to Worcester to buy land. So everything's beginning to line up. So I began to research documents relating to Charles Dougherty, and in fact, I decided to widen my lens, and I began to research all of these names that I found in the list of Scots-Irish migrants, those who were confirmed and documented migrants. Uh, James Forbush, Robert Gray, Hugh Kelso, James McClellan, William McClellan, many others. And it happened to be that here's this list of 5 right here. And as I went through their documents, I found where Charles Dougherty had signed as a witness to a particular deed of one of them, or that, uh, well, in this case right here, here's a document dated 1733. It's, I promised to pay Nathaniel Hastings 45 shillings and for work that he had done. It was signed in Worcester, August 14th. Charles Dougherty signed his own signature to it, and the witness was James Forbes. And James Forbes, he was one of those documented Scots-Irish immigrants. So I'm like, here's connection after connection, tying him to this group. And well, I said, well, but Dougherty is not a Scots-Irish name. Dougherty is a purely Irish name. What gives here? Um, and so as the research unfolds, there were a number of uh, those who were purely Irish and typically Catholic in faith who had converted to become Protestants of some sort, whether Presbyterian or some sort of a Protestant, where they begin to associate themselves with some of those Scots-Irish. And we know there's a whole story of all of that in the background of Northern Ireland. But um, ultimately, it appears that my Dougherty family came to America with this group. Well, interestingly enough, there was some other families. In the records, it talks about the John Young family of the Isle of Burt. Does any Doughertys know that name? The Isle of Burt. It happens to be a Dougherty castle on it in Inishowen. And they were the first family to bring the potato to Worcester, where it was first planted in the several fields in the spring of 1719. And so my first thought was, you know what? What about this Young family? Young is not a purely Irish name. Young is typically, it's, well, it could be Scots, could be English, but the professor is here. He is saying that Young is a purely Irish name. I'm like, doesn't make sense. And then all of a sudden it hit me. I've been studying McConnell which was a sept or a kind of a branch offshoot of the Dougherty family. And a part of that name actually means young. And so maybe as this group was becoming anglicized, as English populations were coming in, maybe they changed their name to Young. I don't know. But interestingly, they were of the Isle of Burt, which is Dougherty territory for certain. And perhaps while they weren't Doughertys by name, uh, you know, everybody's related to a Dougherty when you live in that part of the country. Well, then I find a reference in the Shoot petition, which was a group of the Scots-Irish while they was in Ireland, writing to the governor of Samuel Shute in Massachusetts. One of them was named Alexander McBride. Well, McBride can be a Scottish name and certainly is in some aspects, but one of my research indicates that there was a group of O'Dohertys who became named McBride in the probably the 12th, 1300s or so. And the interesting part is that the petition appears to say Alexander McBride of Bart. And sometimes it may look like it says Bert. Various transcribers have looked at the document. Actually had someone at the New Hampshire Historical Society look at the document, and they said, well, this appears to start with B-U-R. And I'm like, that sounds like Bert to me. Anyway, what it comes down to was that in the 1600s, you have kind of this ethnic fluidity, and your religion played a large part in what culture and what story your family began to associate with. And so as they moved over, it appears there were some of those purely Irish families like the Doughertys. So what kind of connection did the Worcester migration have? I said, well, there was this Edward Fitzgerald. He was there. But in 1718, John McKinstry bought his flock, his saints. He was a pastor. And it it says, the Ulster Scots Agency says, some of those who left Worcester settled a few miles away at Sutton, where Reverend John McKinstry began his ministry about 1720. Well, Sutton was where Dorothy Pond was at the time. So I pretty much settled in my mind from all that broad array of evidence that Charles Dougherty almost certainly came in that migration. So I said, well, did he actually live anywhere near Dorothy Pond? Because the record that I had, um, there was a military record later on that says that Sergeant William Dorothy was born in 1731 in Worcester. And I have several documents that show Charles Dougherty was a resident of Worcester. Well, Dorothy Pond was not in Worcester. It was outside of Worcester. Then I found this curious document that says it was Charles Dougherty of or near Worcester. Or near? What in the world? What is he saying? This doesn't make any sense. A couple of months later, you see this of Worcester, and at first I passed it off that this is just an anomaly. Until I come to this document, which says, I, Charles Dougherty, living adjacent to Worcester in the county of Worcester. And I'm like, okay, there's certainly something more to the story. Then, after digging and digging, I found this document. Charles Dougherty living between the towns of Sutton and Worcester. Like, how can you live between two towns? Because to understand, here where I am from the Midwest, there's you might have a town, you have another town, and there's a lot of rural land in between. But in Massachusetts, the town was essentially the township. Every area was a town. It may not be settled, it may be rural land, but it was considered part of the town. The town was a governmental unit, and the county was completely filled with town land. And then within each town, you might have a central settlement. Uh, but I found this document. I began to look at it, and uh, ultimately what happened is there was these two gentlemen who bought, I don't know if they were gentlemen or not, but they purchased a piece of property, a mill seat from Charles Dougherty, and after a few years of not paying the full balance, they expressed their unjust intention of not paying, and Charles Dougherty took them to court at Cambridge. So the interesting thing is when I not the court summary here that you see that's all written very neatly, nice handwriting, but the original document, and I found this on Family Search. You can find a ton of stuff out there on Family Search. And if you begin to just kind of immerse yourself in it, you can get through and figure out how to find your stuff. But this is a very ugly looking, very edited looking document. It says Charles Dougherty. And I'm like, what in the world? It looks like it once said of Worcester in the county. Uh, and I'm like, okay, but what is this? Here's a little carrot. This has been scribbled out. And up here it says living between ye towns of Sutton and Worcester. And I'm like, oh my goodness. There's a story behind this. It didn't hit me at first, but as I begin to think about it, see, it's more than just the documents. There are stories that are integrally tied into the culture of the area, of the history of the area, of the geography of the area. And if you will take your particular records and your family and begin to see how they fit into the broader story of the area that they were living in, you can see things that you couldn't see before. You could see patterns, ways that they matched up or that they were completely standing out from. And so when the Scots-Irish arrived in Worcester in 1718, they were initially received with much joy. It was here, these group of settlers are here. They're going to help us defend our little beginning settlement that has been torn down twice now by Indian wars, but now they're going to help us establish it against the threat of Indian attack. And what ultimately I discovered was that it wasn't long and they begin to clash. The ideologies, here's congregational English settlers, and here's Presbyterian, Scots-Irish, and Irish settlers. And all of a sudden we see this clash where the Presbyterians are building their church, and a group of some of them were very notable men from the Congregational church came, and in the middle of the night they torched down the almost constructed Presbyterian church. And it was a great disheartening to those settlers. Many of them left and went to other settlements. Some went to Rutland, and some went to Sutton, and some went to other places. Well, um, it seems that my family moved into this little sliver of land. And you see here, I can't remember where I have this map at. Right here. Here's a map of Worcester County. And in this, you see each town plotted off. Here's Worcester, a great big tall town. Eventually, part was broken off into Holden. And you can see even some of these newer grants here, everything is being, except the northwest frontier. This was rather unsettled and almost nobody went up there. But here's this little sliver between the towns of Worcester and Sutton. This is called the country gore, Gore. It was an old word that referred to a triangular shaped piece of land. Well, come to find out, that is exactly where Charles Dougherty lived at. He lived in that little piece of unincorporated property between those two towns. Well, that's very interesting. Because, see, in early Massachusetts, if you lived in a town, you were compelled to go worship at their particular established house of worship. And so people who didn't go and attend the congregational church, they sent out what was called a tithing man to compel them to go to church at that church. And if not, they were fined or they were put in stocks. It just happens to be the culture of the day. And so, very interesting, like my ancestors chose to move out of Worcester into a little place that was not a part of either town. And it just this very narrow little piece of land. In fact, it's about 6 to 8 miles wide. At its narrowest here, it comes to a fine point. On the wide end, it's perhaps a mile, mile and a quarter. So it's a very small piece of land. And the documents most uncertainly tell us that he was living in this tract between the towns of Sutton and Worcester. So we have now a very small window of where he did live at. The problem was he didn't own any property there. And the interesting thing, actually, the pond was so close to this triangular shaped piece of land that when some of the early map makers drew it, they drew Dorothy Pond actually within that triangle piece of land. It wasn't, but it was very close to it. It was less than a half a mile away. Anyway, so I began to research the landowners who lived in this little tract of land, and all of them had these connections or secondary connections to Charles Dougherty. He would witness a piece of property deed for them, or he sold them a piece of land, or here's one. He sells, or actually, he's purchasing from, let's see here, who he's purchasing from Phineas Jones, who happens to be one of the landowners in that, a whole bunch. Let's see, what was it here? Deer skins, 39 deer skins and one moose skin. It's very hard to read, but eventually, when you immerse yourself in this, you can read it. It was dated March 24th, 1732, 33. There was the double dating system in New England at that time. Here you see it relating to 39 deer skins, DEAR skins, and one moose, MOOE. Why they wrote their S's like that, sorry. Anyway, that's uh, it was dated there. It was witnessed by Samuel Dix, who happened to also be one of the landowners in that little section of unincorporated land. And it was witnessed also by James McClellan, who was the son of one of the leaders of the group of 1718 Scots-Irish. So there again, we have on paper 4 men connecting both culture, origin, and the place that they live. And there are so many connections in this, it's absolutely crazy. Um, and right here, here's where Nathaniel Jones lived. Charles Dougherty purchased this piece of property, which has a mill seat actually that he developed on it. And still today, they made a park out of it, and several of the dams are still visible. They're old stone dams. Right here lives William McClellan. Here lives James McClellan. So the Scots-Irish settlers lived within the neighborhood of each other. And so I began to research this. And an interesting thing is I look through all of the deeds, the property transactions. I noticed most of the property transactions that Charles Dougherty made, it was not land that he seemed to purchase with a house on it. And when he sold it, it didn't have a house on it, but almost every one of them was connected by a common theme. The Quinnipoxet River Tract. That very piece of property later comes up and it shows that there's a mill that's built on it. And he sold this piece of property to actually a mill builder, Hezekiah Fletcher. That's the one who didn't pay him, and he sued back and eventually got part of his money. Then here's this other piece that he purchases near Chestnut Hill. Well, when you do the research, and I have it all footnoted, you can see this is the property. This is a historic dam that was built up on there sometime in the 17 or 1800s. And while the first the Worcester history says this privilege was first occupied by Andrew Adams grist mill as early as 1825. However, I did some digging, and when you dig into a niche subject, you find things that other people haven't discovered before. I found in a very interesting document that was about the owner of that piece of property later on was a Tory, and the property was confiscated. And there was an early American court case, and it referenced a cider mill house that was on there in the early 1700s, just right after Charles Dougherty had owned it. So I'm like, here's yet another connection to mills. He purchases a piece of property, and it specifically says 150 acres to set up a grist mill. wow, there's this theme. It keeps coming back. He purchases a piece of property on the 5 Mile River, and it is adjacent to another parcel that the same man had sold that includes watercourses, a mill, pond, and dam. So he seems to be in this trend of this pattern. He seemed to be a mill speculator, at least a mill seat speculator. 1743, he purchased an operating corn mill in Brookfield with the right to pond up additional and build additional mills. Let's see, what does it say right here? With the privilege of building other mills and improving the same. So he had this theme that you begin to connect, and I found the map here. Here's the mill right here, and here's the meeting house of Brookfield. Here's the mill just across. So uh, just a very interesting theme. The cool thing about it is Dorothy Pond has its own mill history, and it only goes back so far, and after that, there's not a lot of record of it. But the fact that it's called Dorothy Pond, or shall we say Dougherty Pond, and the fact that Charles Dougherty was involved with mills, and Dorothy Brook or Dougherty Brook was some of the earliest milling in Sutton, I think there's a connection. So you just see this theme that kind of begins to form. Well, what other Dorothy place names are nearby? You know, we're looking for patterns. We're kind of expand the scope and just look through the area. Well, there's a Dorothy Hill. Well, Dorothy Hill, which I'm just circling the very top of it, but what's right next to it? What is this? Kettle Brook. Kettle Brook is that particular piece of property I showed you back there where there was the mill seat that Charles Dougherty purchased. In fact, here's the outline of Dorothy Hill, and here's the outline of the property that Charles Dougherty owned. It just seems there's a connection. Uh, and so I said, well, if Charles Dougherty did not own a piece of property in this unincorporated tract of land that they call the country gore, or the triangle sliver of land, if he didn't own a piece of property in there, but he lived in there, what in the world? This doesn't make sense. Until I remembered that a lot of Scots Irish were poor and they couldn't afford to buy property. And with the amount of unclaimed property, many of them just became squatters and built a cabin. One particular document I read in of early 1700s Pennsylvania said it was against the laws of nature and the laws of God that so much land should be sitting open and unused, and yet so many people need it. And so, just as in other places, uh, they many of them just um, built a house. And so the map shows sundry farms in the early day in this little strip of land. And so I began to look back and dig back through the records, and I actually traced a chain of title of property all the way back to the first, and found that the first grants of land were not given by any town, because this was not part of the towns, but instead it was distributed by the General Court of Massachusetts, which was their name for the legislature. It was essentially government property. And so they would give out grants of perhaps 150, 3, 4, 500 acres to someone for doing some notable thing for service to their country or to the colony, for building a bridge across a river somewhere, something that somebody would have done, maybe for surveying um, some other land or something. They would give them some of this land. So I began to plot out the original owners of all this land and discover who lived there when. Then I found this petition dated 1743 that says the name of every single person who lived there at that time. Well, Charles Dougherty had already moved on by this time, but this list is very, very, very helpful, because then I can say, I can follow this chain of title, and in the appendixes to this, I do that. I follow that chain of title through, and you can see, and I was able to identify, because in the deeds they actually said they were selling a house or they were selling land without a house. So I began to realize when the houses were constructed, who lived within them at what times. And then so I could create this map that shows where the houses were. And you see they kind of follow this pattern. They're around water. Necessary for human survival. I suppose it's dictated the direction, the patterns of human settlement since the dawn of time. But they seem to be clustered around water, and there seem to be early settlement roads. So I said, at the time the Doughertys showed up, what properties were already distributed out and what was still government property? Well, come to find out, almost all of the property had been given away by the time they show up, except for this section right here, a little sliver of land, and these two properties and this little small piece here. Well, so I start to say they had to live within one of these areas because there were suits of trespass and ejectment for people who were settling on other people's property. And so I'm looking, okay, if they were squatters and they were squatting on government land, which is typically what happens, where were they? So they either had to be here or there. So I begin to look at this piece of property, and the deed in 1735 says it came with stipulations that a home be constructed and 5 acres cleared. Well, that's not where the Doughertys live because there would be a home there already. Another piece of property said this is not capable of being a settlement for any person. So we're whittling this down. We're whittling it away. There was another piece that was about 6 or 7 acres, and then there were 2 rather large parcels. So essentially, we have X'd out this portion in the middle, and now we're looking only right here at this 3 parcels of green. So what I begin to do is say, if they lived there, where would they have lived at? Well, I found an interesting document. What happens when you pull back your scope and begin to look at other things? If you're don't look for your family name all the time, look for the circumstances. So I begin to look for the history of squatters. I begin to look in the journals of the House of Representatives of Massachusetts, and I found at the end of 1732 that there were, it's given to this court that sundry persons in different parts of the province have without leave of this court settled on unappropriated lands, and specifically it's within the counties of Hampshire and Worcester. Well, go back to that map. That map I had not too long ago back here that I showed you. We have, here's Worcester County. Well, where's the unappropriated land? Almost all of this up in here, except here's a little triangle. This is unappropriated. This was the Oxford Gore right here. Here's the country gore, the Worcester Gore right here, which is where we're focusing on. And then I guess there's a little part down here. And up here you've got the Northwest Frontier. And from the same journals of the House of Representatives of Massachusetts, it essentially says within there that there is very little information coming from the Northwest Frontier. So that tells me when I look at this, if somebody was settled in government property in Worcester County, it has pretty much to be here, here, or here. And if almost all the property in these squares has already been granted away to others, as you saw back here in this map, almost there's just a small couple parcels. The chances are pretty high that this reference is referring at least in part to my family. Doesn't spell them out by name, but as any good government committee does, let's say, let's have a committee to make an inquiry, and we'll send some folks down there and take a look at it, and then you can report back at the next session. Well, we all know how that goes, and things happen and some things don't happen. and it never got back to the other house, and they didn't pass it before the end of the session. Now, I actually called and spoke with, um, who was it? I think I called and spoke with one of um, the employees, Stephen T. James, the House clerk, and I asked him about this particular bill, and he said, "Well, boy, that was a long time ago. I don't remember that one." Anyway, he basically said that he was unable to find anything in the house's archives showing where they had ever brought this back. But the interesting thing is this happened during the 1733 legislative season, and the Doughertys moved from there in the winter of 1733 and 34. So it seems almost less than coincidental that it starts becoming a public thing, that there are people squatting on government property, is getting to make colony headlines, and now they're moving out of that property. I find that somewhat less than coincidental. So going back, we're looking at those three little parcels of land. I begin to look at the necessity of what you need for a settlement. We go to, where's the water at? And within all three tracts, there's only one source of water, and it's called the Broadmeadow Brook. As actually, there's a wetland here that's part of a nature reserve. It's a really beautiful place. But the Broadmeadow Brook flows down, and you can see here the very northern portion of Dougherty Pond. And so I start looking at, well, what about the agricultural land? I begin to look at um, this property, and you can see out of this particular area, I got a hold of some state maps, and it's part of their Massachusetts mapper. And there's all kinds of different layers that you can put over the map to show everything from what's prime farmland to how deep the soil is and what is rocky outcrops and coarse stratified gravel. So here's a big chunk of gravel. Here's a big chunk of rock. It's the soil just here is not good for farming. You can see here prime farmland. Here you just get this little section here, here, and maybe a small amount over here. We'll look at the pH of the soil. And of course, my mom had her trusty Rodale's Encyclopedia of Gardening, and it says highly acidic soils with a pH of 3 to 4, very few crop plants will tolerate that. Well, let's look at the map. Well, here's 3 and 4, 4, and so almost all of this is not tolerable for cropland except just this little strip right along essentially the edge of the road. And so we're looking for this place where the available property, where access via a county road, where water all coincide. Well, there's only one place within these three parcels, and that's right here. Well, this is the northern point of Dougherty Pond, and we're talking, I don't know, a few tenths of a mile. So within 5 minutes from that point, they could walk to Dougherty Pond. There was actually a law that provided no man shall come upon another's property without their permission. And so that's why they had these county roads. And I begin to look at some of this property, and that little sliver of land, come to find out, a piece of property had been resurveyed, and that sliver used to be much larger. Instead of being 6 or 7 acres, it was a couple dozen acres. So I'm pretty certain that's where they lived at. Well, that was very close to what was called Dorothy Pond Meadow. Meadows were necessary for farmers, and the very earliest record of Charles Dougherty says that he is a husbandman, which is a farmer. And I read a book, a wonderful little book about the history of meadows and their necessity in early Massachusetts agriculture. And pretty much everybody had to have a chunk of meadow, even if they had to travel to it. And so what was once called Dorothy's Pond Meadow is actually, today it's lying underneath the pond. They, they raised the pond about 10 foot for a canal that they were building. But you can see here meadow by a swamp. Um, and so I began to look at that Dorothy's Pond meadow, and I plotted it all out, except there's some places that aren't accounted for. Um, anyway, a long story short, I eventually pinned down my family to a very small radius of land, which just happens to be about half a mile from Dougherty Pond. And of course, the state law allows anyone who lives in the area to fish at a pond that's a great pond, a pond of 10 acres or more. Um, every inhabitant shall have free fishing and fowling. Well, Charles Dougherty was he was a hunter, because in fact even his last will and testament shows, or his probate rather, it shows that he had a rifle, a few cows, and so he had a necessity to hunt to provide for his family, and also a necessity to have a place to put them. And at Dorothy Pond was the Dorothy Pond Meadow. So a long story, and ultimately I recap it, and there's a lot of very interesting stuff. I actually go back and I spend the first 50 pages giving a history of the area. Um, but it was a fun project, really. I kind of did it just for my own fun, but I figured I should share it. And so I began to try to write it in a way that would be where other people could read it. So I gave the local residents a history. Nobody had written a concise history of their pond. And so I kind of wrote an overview of the history, tells some very interesting stuff. There was ice harvesting. There was a lot of milling. Here's some early stuff to do with the raising of the level of Dorothy Pond. But I guess a long story short was that there wasn't any smoking gun. And you're going to get into some of your family research and you're going to realize that there is not a quote unquote smoking gun that says exactly what you want it to say. Um, Ultimately, what we find is sometimes the problem is just having the patience to keep researching and to keep coming back. And something that will help is expand your focus, not just to your spelling of the name, not just to your particular family, but look for others with the name. Look for patterns and trends. And, really, this work would not exist if it wasn't for pulling in research from other disciplines. I mean, goodness gracious, I went from everything of researching the history of agriculture to the history of the migrations. Just you pull in all kinds of things, and eventually hopefully, you can come to a succinct conclusion. I feel I was very blessed to be able to uh, finally bring this all to a head. It could have been to a point where I would have just said, there's a cool pond name. It could be part of the family, might not, and it could have been that was all there was. But I just kept on researching, and ultimately, uh, you can do the same thing. What I did is I put it all in a Microsoft Word document. I put my footnote citations, and I recommend highly that you do. I have read so many old historical works that have no footnote citations, and I'm like, but where did you learn this at? Who told you this? Because what we don't understand is that later on, as time goes, more and more records will appear. More and more things will be digitized and transcribed. And there will come a point where some statement or some claim that you made, the evidence may not back it up. Something may be conflicting. Well, if you have the source of why you wrote that, then they can look at that and make their own decision and their own judgment there and say, you know what, he was pretty close here, but guess what? We found a new record and it says this, and actually, he was partly right here, but this is the more complete truth. Because when we're trying to find things that happened 300 years ago, You can't go dig nobody up, and the records often are lost to time. Courthouses burned, just all kinds of things happen. And so I recommend you reach out to the local community, wherever that is that you're doing research. It may not be local to you, but reach out to libraries, historical societies, genealogical societies, historical commissions. Say, hey, what do you know? And then as you work through your process, bounce ideas off of them. That's what I did. I literally, the group of people that live at Dorothy Pond, they were so generous to me. I had people that I could email and talk to, and who would go and take pictures of things for me. One gentleman took pictures, another gentleman went to an old church and looked for records, one dug in the town archives. It's good to make friends because, well, have some fun along the way. Um, and so I slapped this all. I said, well, how am I going to print this? And I looked at various options and I finally settled on Lulu, which is just a self-publisher. I downloaded their template. I pasted what I had in there so far, began to work with it, and eventually I finally said, okay, I've got to stop tweaking it and just say it's good enough and let's publish it. That's the perfectionist in me. But what I did, every image that I wanted, I made sure it was either in public domain, or if it wasn't, I got written permission. I footnoted, I cited everything, I gave every image a reference figure underneath it. Then I submitted a copyright application to the Library of Congress after I applied for even what do you call those? ISBN. Got me an ISBN, the whole 9 yards. And it's not hard. It is not hard to publish something. And it just takes a little bit of time, a little bit of going on YouTube, watching some videos, and you can publish your family history. It may not be that it's, something that's going to end up in a bunch of libraries, but it may be something that you give to your family, that you send to a local historical society. And maybe down the road somebody forgets you wrote it, but your great grandchildren say, you know what, I want to learn about my family history. And they go to the historical society and what, there's your book. Who knows? But it was a fun process. It really was fun. I learned a lot. And now that I've published my first book, who knows? Who knows? Um, are there any questions?
If you have a question, you could raise your hand or just even unmute. We don't have a lot of people at this point, that we'd overwhelm each other. So Rosalind,
Yeah, I was wondering if there was any chance that that pond might have been a mill pond.
That pond started out as a fishing spot, and I'm uncertain, but my belief is that there may have been an early mill there that was an undershot mill, roughly built in the early 1700s. Um, the earlier mills before, I'm going to say the somewhere around the 1770s, you start getting the big mills that you see in pictures that are like 3 or 4 stories tall. The before that, there were simple mills, maybe 1 or 2 story in a loft. They were typically constructed out of wood, and usually the wood didn't last a tremendous amount of time. Buildings eventually rotted down. If something's left for 10 or 20 years, it's completely rotted down. There's a few piles of stones. Well, guess what? Neighbors building a house, they need some stones. So often things disappear. I don't know. I do know there was some early milling around that, so it's very possible. Several people who owned notable mills in the area also owned a little piece of the property at the end of the pond. So your guess is as good as mine, but I would say very possibly yes.
Yeah, well, given his interest in property that had mills, it's entirely likely I would have said that he was associated with a mill on that pond,
Yeah.
using the water from that pond to turn a mill.
Are you Dr. Lenny?
Yeah.
Oh, good to talk to you in person.
Oh, hello. Yes.
I
Hi.
think you're actually quoted in my book.
Oh, there you go. Well, 1718 is an interest of mine, so I'll
Yes,
follow
there
up
you are.
on Worcester and Fitzgerald and all of those people.
Well, thanks for joining.
Well, it was interesting. It was a good talk. Thank you.
Thank you. I
Yep.
appreciate that.
Then Shirley Monkhouse.
Can
have
you
your
hear
hand up?
me?
Yes,
Uh-huh.
ma'am.
Rosalind comes in from Ireland and I come in from Canada, so I don't know where you're getting all us from,
Hey.
but I I thought halfway through, you explained it at the end, but halfway through I thought this is the best example of a location research report I've ever heard. So
Thank you.
yes, you're welcome. You're much welcome. So I started looking at the genealogical proof standard, and they're starting to really emphasize location reports. And the professionals do that now because, and this, I thought, I'm surprised, and it's a lovely surprise, but you need to have those research reports specifically. It's helpful in Ireland because you might have seen a townland or some location on a cemetery stone or in some document somewhere. So I've helped somebody because they say Leitrim, and I said, well, is that a townland or is that a county or is that a parish? And I found their ancestors because they thought they were in Leitrim, which was on one side of Ireland, and they were in Leitrim, which was next door to the parish in Down that my people came from, which up in Canada, they did come like in America. They grouped together. They stayed with known families or stayed with
Yes,
known
yes.
church groups and things. So having a location report would have, this fellow, I said, well, how many Leatrims do you think there are? And he thought, and what's written in stone may not always be as accurate as you think. So anyways,
That
but
is true.
yeah, exactly. But I was going to say I'm failing to remember exactly what they require for a location report, but it'd be interesting because you certainly did that. Do you think if you'd done the relocation report, you'd been able to find the documents faster, or is this was just one step after another step after another step? Like you just had to needle this thing one step at a time?
Yes, yes. It started with that um, looking across Google Maps and coming across the name of the pond. And in the back of my mind, I knew I had seen a record where the surname was spelled in a much butchered up way of Dorothy. And I kind of just began to pick at that. And I started, like I said, reaching out to the local people, and they said we didn't know. And I actually did a chain of title because I said, well,
Yeah.
let's see if we can find anything. I did a chain of title, and it took me forever. I literally read thousands. I read thousands of these deeds in these very, very hard to read handwriting. But I worked my way back from the present to the very early 1700s, and in some cases, some 1600 land grants, one from a Native American to a particular group who became the town owners. So it was a lot of that. Without the county registry of deeds, this document would not exist. The research would not have been possible. But between, I would say, 70% deeds, 20% uh, court records, and the rest of it just circumstance. But a lot of people skip over those records because they're looking for what's on ancestry.com. But the deeds, people were agricultural, and so almost everybody owned property. If they didn't own property, they rented property, and sometimes there's even a record of that, but or witness to something. But often the court records and the property records are overlooked, and there's such a treasure trove of information in them.
It's true. Your pattern is like 100 years before my Canadians, and it seemed like they started there in this New England part, and then they South Carolina, the southern parts, and
Mhm.
then they started coming to Canada. And your records are phenomenal. Oh, I was going to say that about the records. I was going to tease you about that. You were making a joke about how come they make the F's and the S's.
I was just kidding. Yeah.
I know you were kidding, but it it took me back 50 years. When I was in high school, one of my art class courses was calligraphy, and I kept breaking the needle and the tip on the end of the the ink pen, and the teacher got mad at me. This is 50 years ago. It's because my name is Shirley. I kept insisting on making S's, and my last name is Marshall. So I had these S's, and I broke the tip when I was trying to go back and do S. I think that's why they changed it to F, because S's are too hard to do. You break the tip. That's my joke, anyways. I don't know. I think we should ask somebody that does calligraphy and see how hard it is to do S's. Anyway, is this your book?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh,
So
that's lovely.
if you go to dorothypond.com, and this is another thing, if you publish a book, get yourself a website is what they say. Even if it's something niche, it's out there. And then I put the link here. You can click on it, and it takes you to the Lulu uh, point of, or the storefront. Nobody's going to remember this long Lulu URL. And so rather than share that, I just made a simple dorothypond.com and kind of tell you a little bit about the book. Here's some references, here's some press releases, here's a little bio, and kind of what is in each of the books. There's so much I didn't cover, but actually in one place, um, I didn't know about this at the time, but as I'm researching later, I read a document published by the Federal Reserve about inflation in Massachusetts in the 1700s. Just like random reading, right? And as I read that, I come across the fact that inflation skyrocketed. And then it all of a sudden hit me why in one of the deeds, instead of asking for just a certain amount of money in pounds, Charles Dougherty specifically demanded payment in silver.
Mm.
It hit me, inflation. And so all of these stories, all of the news of the day, which is now history to us, on every different level, you have all these different disciplines that when you layer them on top of each other, it begins to paint the picture of what was going on in their life at that time. And then you can see, oh, wow, that's why he did this. So you can put all these pictures together. And he really overextended himself, and he would have probably been able to do it if it wasn't for the inflation. But there come a point where he had to basically get out of the speculatory business for a little over a decade until some of his sons got old enough to help out with the farm, and then he was able to begin speculating again. But then he died a couple years later, so mill work life was hard.
Well, and also too, Will, you had already done the family research to know that that was your family. So
Yeah,
this
yeah.
was an
Oh,
add-on.
that took 7 years before
Yeah,
this 5 years.
yeah,
But just a little here and there in my spare time.
right. As we do, those of us that loved this. I loved your presentation. I know the different times you and I've talked over the last few years, and I just loved hearing the story again and all the nuances of what you discovered, and it just was great, really good. Does anybody else have any questions for our master researcher here? So I think, is there anything else, Will, that you would want to share with us within your whole process? One thing I was going to mention about the Lulu is it does give you an opportunity to create an account, but you don't have to. You can purchase the book just as a guest and not
Yeah,
have to create an account.
yeah.
So
So you can do one book if you want, or a few for family for Christmas.
yeah,
Um, Even if it's just taking your old family photographs and throwing them in a Word document and putting some caption and saying, hey, print me a copy. I mean,
yeah.
get something in print because people's devices go down all the time.
Yeah, and self-publishing seems to have this mystique about it, but it really is not hard to do.
No. Thank you
So,
all. I
yeah,
appreciate everybody joining this. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask, but you can always shoot me a message. Let's see here at the bottom of the website, book@dorothypond.com. So,
well,
yeah.
and also on our Dougherty Clan Association website, since you are our webmaster on that,
Oh,
and
yeah.
then I'm sure if somebody posted something in there, I'm sure you would answer it. Because that's how you are. So yeah,
Yeah.
ODoughertyAssociation.org. So yeah. All right. Well, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, everybody. And Will, if you don't have any final comments to say, we'll close the meeting and thank everyone for coming. I will stop the recording and then we'll close the meeting. So.